Josh, as you've thought about social media, I'm sure you've worked with, you've shared, you've worked with people from a number of ages, and you've also, done research about human psychology and mental health. And so kind of what are the first things that come to mind as you think about social media? Um, you know, I, is it positive? Is it negative? Like, where does it kind of land for you?
It's powerful.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I think it's tempting with things like this to very quickly move to moral categories of good or bad.
Mm.
Um, and as a therapist, that's one of the first sets of categories that actually um, you have to put pause, you
Mm.
have to push pause on to do effective work with people.
Mm.
Um, because if I decide it's good or it's bad, effectively what I've done is I've collapsed my curiosity about what it means and the effects that it has. And if I start out with if I approach something with only two buckets, I'm forced to put it into one of the buckets
Mhm.
rather than breaking it into all of its much more complex pieces and evaluating them individually. And so social media for some people, it's their entire livelihood. For some people, it has been
Yeah.
an escape out of poverty. For some people, it has allowed them to stay connected during COVID. It's been literally the medium that they've been able to interact with a parent who's in the hospital.
Right.
Um,
Wow.
so there are so many ways um, that it operates. We've had these same ethical debates about the printing press, about the telephone, about every medium of technology, every way of connecting humans together. We've
Mm.
had ethical debates about. Strangely, this is one that we haven't had much of a social debate about at all.
Hmm.
We've just kind of adopted it and moved straight into this era where it's ubiquitous before we've even had the conversation. You and I are like the last generation that can see it
Yeah.
because um, younger kids, this is the water they swim. It's like trying to describe water to a fish. Like this is their world. This is their reality. Most of their closest friendships have been developed, at least supplemented by these platforms, if not on these platforms.
Yeah.
And so um, to realize that their mapping of how to do relationship, like you and I come to social media and we get frustrated that it doesn't work like normal relationship.
Mhm.
Kids now try to interact in the world and get frustrated that it doesn't work like social media.
Yeah.
This is the primary. The currency of these platforms is shame and fame. That's what's being offered.
Mhm.
And so
Mm.
every kid who has social media is famous,
Mhm.
which means they deal with all the psychology
Okay.
of a child actor.
Oh my gosh.
How many of those turned out good?
Jeez. No, I mean, yeah, that's nuts, man. I,
Every single kid is in the Mickey Mouse Club.
dude.
But what we do know is that like from 2010 to 2017, because the years after that are still kind of being that data is still being pulled together. From 2010 to 2017, which is really the era that um, um, smartphones kind of started ending up in everyone's hands, and when social media really blew up. I mean, Facebook came out in what, 2004, but it was a thing that was limited to a handful of schools,
Right.
and it was a slow rollout. So really 2010 is about the time that young kids are
Mhm.
spending significant amounts of time on these brand new platforms,
Mhm.
and the mental health outcomes that we can measure from that, as far as reports of anxiety, depression, and suicide. Um, have gone up drastically. And the fastest growing subgroup within that is adolescent girls, which historically have never had high suicide numbers. And so that is statistically, that it's very alarming. And it's important to point out, whenever we're dealing with statistics and looking at studies like this, we have to know the difference between causation and correlation.
Right.
Just because something goes up and then we see this also go up does not necessarily mean that this is causing that.
Right.
But in this case, so it's not as simple as saying like, well, if you use social media, you'll get depressed.
Right.
No, it's not an if-then statement. But social media makes, the more that you use social media as a teen, the more likely, because you're on the platform, the more likely you are to experience cyberbullying. And cyberbullying has the same psychological effects as bullying. And bullying has the same psychological effects as any other kind of abuse, which means it doesn't matter if somebody, you know, this whole adage of like sticks and stones may break my bones, but you know, it's BS. Like it doesn't I'll tell you as a therapist, whether the trauma was physical or the trauma was inflicted through words, it almost doesn't matter. The scars are the same.
Wow.
And so
that's heartbreaking.
And so whether it's one, stepping into a space where people have an increased level of anonymity, and so most people on social media are willing to say things that they would never say to another person face to face.
Yeah.
So when you take that and then you also give that to teens who are trying to navigate the world at a really just awkward phase of human development, no matter what, trying to differentiate. This is the time of differentiation, of them figuring out, who am I in relation to my parents? How am I going to be this? You know, it's go back through, you know, the whole catalog of just like classic American films that explore the high school era. Like every high school film has all the cliques and all those things. All of those dynamics now exist on steroids. And at a rapid rate. So one, people are interacting and now have a higher rate of exposure statistically to being bullied. Two.
So just to highlight that a little bit, it's like if you were getting picked on in the lunchroom, you go home where it used to be a sanctuary and it's the lunchroom again, because the same kids that were picking on you in the lunchroom are still picking on you at home in your room by yourself, right? So is that kind of the idea that what's happening at school or wherever the challenges are very potential?
It goes home with you. It lives in your pocket. Yeah.
Yeah. So, right. Wow. So a kid's exposure to those same dynamics that can be incredibly challenging in adolescence. It's just higher because
now it's not, you're not just exposed to the bully kids in your school.
Oh my gosh.
You're exposed to every troll on the planet.
Holy cow. I didn't even think of that. That is awful. That gave me chills. I do not like that.
So there's that. And then there's just how accessible you are at all times. It's like, where do you go?
Yeah.
Where do you run away from a bully, when he lives in the only space where you connect with your friends?
Yeah.
So there's that piece. There's the other piece that is subtle, but actually quite powerful, in that now we interact in these spaces in words and images, which is different than interacting with a person face to face. And so the quality of our interactions it's different. You can write a letter to someone and still feel very connected to them, and that there's nothing wrong with trying to interact with somebody in words. But for kids, especially at this time of personality development, kids have already for a long time had to deal with just being self-conscious around body image, especially in American culture, and especially girls. And it's not only girls. but that is a major contributor to teen suicide. Are just the fact that most of the images that are posted now are edited.
Yeah.
And so now at a very young age, I'm comparing my real body to a digitally manipulated image on a screen.
Really
One of the other pieces of I mean, because social media, the algorithms are optimized for time on site. And so they are designed to keep you scrolling, which is another way of saying that they and the people in Silicon Valley even use this language. They are intentionally designed to be addictive. And so and they're masterfully designed to do that. Actually the amount of dopamine that your brain produces in response to a notification, not even reading a text, not even opening Facebook to find out, just the ding on your phone or the flash or the vibration, the amount of dopamine is equivalent to like a bump of cocaine.
Wow.
So it's incredibly powerful. And so
and that's that physiological reaction, right, happening
yes.
in
Yep.
in
that has nothing to that none of this is conscious thought. Right. None of it at all. This is all it's a physiological thing.
That's the fight or flight. You're like, what's that? And then and then you look down and you have a notification. Now, okay,
in this case it's pleasure. And so what we're dealing with is a hyper intense stimulus. It's a hyper intensified source of pleasure. And so if that's all I'm engaging all the time, by comparison, all the normal sources of pleasure in my life become insignificant or less significant. Wow. And so it over time, at a neurological level, it actually has a numbing effect. So that seeing a sunset literally no longer feels the same.
Wow.
Because of just the exposure, the rapid exposure just to interesting images.
You know, that thing you said about the like effect of like seeing a notification on your phone. I think for parents, something that in order to kind of just emphasize the weight of that, imagine like a kid getting excited about a notification that they got and then seeing that it was somebody trolling them or making fun of them. I mean, that just must be so devastating. And
yeah, the intensity of those emotions is massive.
Yeah. And so it makes sense, you know, I think from a parental standpoint, I would imagine it would make more sense as to why it's so hurtful. And not just in the sense that, hey, my kid's getting bullied, but even just in that instant where their hopes were raised that somebody had reached out to them. And then they see that it's actually something really not just bad, but it's like painful or hurtful. That's not fair. And I don't.
Yeah, if we categorize at least the bad parts of social media as toxic relationship, toxic social interaction, then the antidote to the toxic version is the healthy version. Because the impulse that's driving us to these mediums, at least the part of us that thinks we're choosing that, is usually being driven by this thing that we call FOMO, right? Which at a more basic level is really it's the desire to belong. And so what we're talking about, and it's important to note this. I'm going to try to quickly go through this little experiment that was done because it sets up where we're going. And it's an experiment that's done on addiction. It was done with opiates and mice. And if you put a mouse in a cage by itself and you give it the option of water or the opiate laced water, or really just like straight morphine, the mouse will take the morphine over and over and over again to the extent that it will stop eating, it'll stop drinking, and it'll die.
Hmm.
Because that's how addiction functions. We will self-sabotage to the point that we will destroy ourselves to keep doing the thing, even though we know it's harming us. That's the definition of addiction, is anything that you do over and over again, knowing the consequences, and still you can't stop.
Yeah.
You take the same mice and you put them together in a cage with the food, with the water, and the drugs. Virtually none of them become addicted. They'll all try it a couple times. They'll kind of use it recreationally every once in a while. Some of them, many of them will never try it again. And so part of what that is looking at is that the limbic part of our brain, which we do have in common with little animals like that.
Yeah.
We are not mice.
Yeah.
Mice are not humans. But the parts of our brain that actually function in this way are virtually the same. It's that basic.
Wow.
It's not, we're not thinking about it. The addict is not thinking. And so the thing that's, and there's a guy named Gabor Mate in BC who has worked extensively with the heroin epidemic in Canada.
Hmm.
And his research has discovered the number one determinant of addiction of all kinds, which includes social media. So it's very relevant to what we're talking about, that ding, that notification. The number one thing that determines if you're actually going to become highly addicted to that is loneliness.
Hmm.
Your sense of belonging. And
Wow.
so the antidote, if we know that we're sending kids into an environment where they're potentially going to be exposed, we're sending them into the cage to play with their friends, and we know there's heroin in the cage. We can't remove the heroin from the cage.
This is the
So
social media analogy, right?
Yes. Yes.
So the mice
Yes.
and the heroin is kids and
Yeah.
social media.
So if that's what these digital landscapes are,
Yep.
we know that there is the high potential for addiction.
Mm-hmm.
But the antidote to addiction is the same it's always been, and the same it's been in every field, and it's belonging.
Mm-hmm.
Because the same chemicals, this is really interesting, like the chemicals that are released in our brains when we hug someone for 20 seconds, the chemicals that are released in our brains when we feel a sense of belonging, the chemicals that are released in our brains when we feel seen and heard and deeply known, are actually natural opiates.
Wow.
So we are designed to be addicted, but it's a matter of, are we going to be addicted to each other in healthy relationship, or are we going to move toward the counterfeit? And that's where social media, I think, it calls itself it calls itself social media, but it cannot deliver on the promise of actually offering true human rich interaction.
Yeah.
And this is where I think it's interesting in an evangelical context, because you can go theological with this, that the relation, even the God of the universe who has designed us this way, knew that the only way we would actually really truly feel loved is if it was incarnational, if it had skin on. And so disembodied digital interaction, it's not worthless, it's just not social. Really, the thing that we crave, and the thing that infants crave, even before they have language, before they can actually communicate, what they crave is the face.
Mm-hmm.
We need to see, we know who we are when we see ourselves reflected back in the face of the other. Wow. That's how we find out who we are. Is reading the micro expressions of how someone else experiences us in the world. That's what gives us an understanding of who we are and how we show up in the world. It has to be interactive. And that's where, again, these platforms they're not worthless. I don't think that they're just inherently evil. I think, like we said before, they're powerful. In some ways, we let them out of the cage way before we asked enough questions to figure out how to mitigate a lot of this stuff. And so we're trying to figure it out as a culture as we go.
Hopefully this will be a helpful tool for parents to be more aware. And this is just one of those, don't touch the waffle iron conversations.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that you can't like waffles.
Yeah. All right, Josh. Hey, thank you, man. This has been really, really great. So your insight is so helpful and deeply needed too. So thank you.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you.